But I think this is something that's on a number of people's minds, and it came from an economist who writes that there have been appeals to Russia and China, among others, to break from the dollar system, which is being collapsed by the actions of our own government at present. Even if Obama is removed, how do you know that we can trust the governments of Russia and China to work with the post-Obama U.S. government?
Well, you should read Percy Shelley's A Defense of Poetry. The principle of society is not the individual will as such. The individual will plays a part in society, obviously. But there are, as in poetry, in great poetry, it succeeds and is classical because it addresses the principle which Shelley raises in his A Defense of Poetry and emphasizes and underscores in the last paragraph of that particular writing. It's actually the principle of social dynamics, that human behavior is not based on what is usually most obvious, what people say or that sort of thing. Human behavior is based on an idea which is very much similar to Albert Einstein's description of the significance of the discovery of gravitation by Johannes Kepler. That there are higher principles in the universe of various kinds. Some we can consider as permanent, or more or less permanent. Others we can consider as transitional. Gravitation, of course, is a more or less permanent principle. The idea of gravitation, of a universe that is finite in its immediate form, but is not bounded externally. And poetry, the best poetry, as Shelley describes it, is based on this same principle as it applies in classical art. That there are moods, or what seem to be moods, in the course of a period of life of a population, in which people are swept by a common principle which is in one sense elusive and yet extremely efficient. For example, when the United States population was under the influence before June of 1944, when the invasion of France occurred, at that point, a change occurred in the US mood. Because what had happened was that Hitler was put into power both from the city of London, from British financial circles, and also by people in New York City, such as Brown Brothers Harriman, as by the grandfather of President George W. Bush Jr., who personally put Hitler into power in Germany. The British put Hitler into power in Germany. But then, when something happened, there was a change, on Churchill's part in particular. The recognition that since Hitler had forces, military forces, had succeeded in beating a superior force in France, that is, the military forces of France were superior to the military forces of Germany at that time. And yet the German Wehrmacht won the war against France because a fascist government rigged it. Now, two surprises for the British. First of all, they had always intended to back Hitler's invasion against the Soviet Union. And that part of fascism was always understood. But they had always understood that France and Germany, or England and Germany, would contain Hitler because the toll of fighting a war against the Soviet Union would weaken Germany, so that the French and British forces combined could control Germany. It's called the Western Front, the concept of the Western Front. What had happened is that some of the Wehrmacht had convinced Hitler that this was stupid to go against the Soviet Union before you had eliminated France, because otherwise France would be used to crush Germany after the war with the Soviets. So therefore, you had a fascist government in France. And the fascist government in France ranged the command, the French command, in such a fashion that the worst possible troops were put in the most critical positions and the best troops were put in the worst positions. The best commanders were put in the worst commands, and the worst commanders were put in the best commands. And because of this, they were able to orchestrate, which was otherwise an impossible victory of the Wehrmacht in France. As this thing developed, some people in England suddenly got the bright idea that this had all been a very bad idea. Bad for the cause of fascism, among other things. So therefore, Churchill led the drive to ally with the United States, which they had intended to destroy. The United States was on the victim of the chopping block after this war to crush Germany had been intended. So now he came kissing the United States. And all the people in Wall Street who had backed Hitler directly and fully consciously, like the grandfather of the recent President Bush and the father of that Bush, were all Nazis. And they have not changed their essential character to this day. So then what happens? June 6th, 1944. The Allied invasion of northern France breaks through. The German command, military command, says we've got to negotiate surrender. The British then are afraid the Americans will be able to handle that. The Wehrmacht is ready to make a coup against Hitler. The British tip off Hitler's crowd about this. So the Wehrmacht commanders who were going to turn against Hitler in order to secure peace were killed. And the United States became the target of destruction by Winston Churchill. That's the way these things work. So if we understand, the strategic move is crucial here, which the American people generally are ready to go with, and that is a Glass-Steagall clean-out of the international monetary system, financial system. Because if we use the Glass-Steagall standard, the entirety of the fake value of this bubble, this financial bubble, is wiped out. Two things follow from that wipeout. Number one, by getting rid of that debt, the Wall Street debt, the bailout debt, we now enable the United States government to reorganize the banking system, wipe out Wall Street. We don't need Wall Street. Just wipe it out, bankrupt it. It's bankrupt, it's worthless, it can't pay its debts. Wipe it off. We no longer owe anything to Wall Street. They can't pay their debts. They're worthless. They are bankrupted. We don't need Wall Street because all we have to do is take this sick and actually bankrupt Federal Reserve System, which is also bankrupt, in fact. We absorb it as a bankrupt institution under the U.S. law. It's a bankrupt U.S. institution, a private institution of a special type. We bankrupt it. We put the assets and the key personnel who are useful in the Federal Reserve System in the Third National Bank of the United States. Now we fund the Third National Bank of the United States as a vehicle of funding the rebuilding of the U.S. economy. And we are very careful to eliminate all centers of power of those who have brought us into this mess. We have members in the Congress. We have people in other institutions of government. We have people who are not officially in government, but who are very influential in circles of government, who will act under those circumstances to save the United States. And if we're successful, we will reach a quick agreement. And that will not be distant from now. A quick agreement with Russia, China, and India. Once we reach that agreement, we will set up a fixed exchange rate treaty agreement among the United States and these other three powers. We will then bring other nations into the four-power agreement under the protection of the four-power agreement because they're weaker nations. We will take the kind of projects which are being discussed by Russia, China, and India today, those types of projects. We will create international credit under a fixed exchange rate system to rebuild the world economy. Now, in a shift like type, you have three shifts to look at here. You have the condition of the mood, the dominant mood, at the time that Hitler was running high under British protection. You have the counter thrust, which is coming from Franklin Roosevelt, from the United States. You have the point that the British are coming to the United States and saying, save our ass. And Franklin said, yes. But at the end of the war, the empire's gone. Franklin died, and they came back in with Truman. So the mood swung actually from July of 1944, where suddenly all these people who had faithfully supported the United States, together with the British, against Hitler during that interval, suddenly went back to being pro-Hitler, but not Hitler as such, but to the fascist idea. And that included Bush, the grandfather of the recent President Bush, who was a Nazi, who personally moved the money on behalf of Brown Brothers Harriman to fund Hitler so he wouldn't go bankrupt so he could become Chancellor of Germany. Then the swing back during the war, when the British decided, so therefore we had a real support, a consensus of the United States that we were going to defeat Hitler, and we did it. But in the meantime, there was a shift back to a pro-fascist view in the US Congress in the general election, federal election of 1944. That gave us the Truman era. We had a shift back from that, partly under Eisenhower. It was against that fascist, stupid pig, Truman. But it was a limited one. John F. Kennedy came in, and by the time he got into the fight over the SEAL question, he was really committed to a Franklin Roosevelt orientation. He was killed because he opposed a war in Indochina, a U.S.-long war in Indochina. He opposed that on the basis of consultation with General Douglas MacArthur and basically with Dwight Eisenhower. So we got the war. We got the swing. Then we got the 68er, another swing. Now the 68er generation is about to go out of power. The 68er generation, except for those who are the people who are protesting out there against Obama, the ones who like to be 68ers still, are the ones who are hated. So now we're having a mood swing. The American people are ready, again, as Shelley defines this kind of swing, are ready to mobilize for certain ideas if they recognize them. Once they do, they will back the change. And you won't be able to control them. As long as you just stick to the program. You won't worry about controlling them. And we will have a Congress which once again becomes honestly representative of the American people. And you will find all the buried, hidden patriots inside the US government will suddenly come out and show the guts again to start doing their job as leaders of our government. That, I think, is our perspective.